extremely effective on a whole range of dimensions. But what you've also had is that it's very expensive. In 2007, BRAC spent about $300 per household to implement the Ultra Poor program. Now, if you translate that into purchasing power parity and discount it up to 2014, which is the last day in our sample, it's about $1,300 per household in PPP. So, in order to understand whether this makes financial sense, we have to compare the quantity of benefits to the cost of the program. And of course, the benefits, the size of benefits, depends on how long these benefits go for. So I'm going to present you two extreme scenarios, one after the other. In this first scenario there, we assume that the benefits last forever. So the same gain in consumption that we observe at year 4, we assume that it lasts forevermore, for the life of the women and the life of their descendants and so on. In that case, the benefit-cost ratio is 5.4. So for every dollar that you spend in the program, the return for the ultra poor is $5.4. That's a very good number. But you might tell me, but that's absurd. The benefits aren't supposed to last forever. Things will go wrong, the cow will die, the benefits will taper off over time. So another exercise that you can do is to ask yourself, how quickly should the benefits die for the program to break even? Now, the answer to that is that everything should disappear the moment we measure it. So at 4 years, we measure some benefits. If after 4 years those benefits go poof, they'll be almost break even. The cost will be slightly higher than the benefit. So these are the two extreme case scenarios. If we know for a fact that there were benefits after year 4, so if the benefits evaporate right there, for every dollar that you spend, you get 80 cents in returns. If the benefits last forever, at the same rate as they did in year 4, the ratio becomes 5.4. The truth might be somewhere in the middle, or might be even outside of that range, because the possibility that we still haven't discussed is that actually things get better over time. So the only way of answering that question is to follow up the beneficiaries for longer. And that's what we did. Thanks to the collaboration of BRAC, who patiently implemented yet another survey on yet the same beneficiaries. We went back to the field in 2014. BRAC managed to track 93% of the beneficiaries, which is a very high, or rather very low attrition rate. And we can use these to describe the long-term trends in the program. Note that the deal was that in 2011, BRAC would start treating the control. And indeed, that's what they did. So by 2014, about 30% of our controls are treated. So we don't have a clean control group like we used to. But because we have many time periods, what I'm going to show you is the trend in the control, assuming that they will stay on the same path as where they started. So we can look at these long-term trends, and this can inform the cost-benefit analysis and the sustainability of the program overall. So the first graph that I'm going to show you here is expenditure on non-durables. And the first two dots are the change after 2 years. And the red here is treatment, and the blue is control. And you see, this is the data that you saw this morning. After 2 years, there's a small effect. After 4 years, there's a much bigger effect. Those bars there are confidence intervals, so you see that they don't overlap. So the difference between the blue line and the red line is the difference in difference that Robin showed this morning. And now you want to know what happened after 7 years, and that's what happened. Okay, you see that the yearly change in per capita expenditure on non-durables after 7 years is much larger than after 4 and after 2 years. As I said already, we don't have the pure control group, but we can interpolate what would have happened to the controls had they kept on the same trend that they were on before. And that's what the dashed line does. Okay? You can make your favorite scenario. You see that for the control to catch up with the treatment, and hence the program had no effect after 7 years, they must have had experienced a super sharp increase in consumption. And nothing of what was going on before makes us think that that would be the case. So that's durables. So the first graph was non-durables. This is durables, household goods like TVs and radios and refrigerators and sewing machines and the like. And as you can see, the pattern is very similar. The change after 7 years is as large, if not larger, than after 4. That is as large, if not larger, than after 2. This is productive assets. Again, same message. Okay? The change after 7 years here seems to be the same as the change after 4. And the controls are completely flat. You saw this morning that these households have no productive assets, a baseline. So the control had no productive assets in 2007, keep having no productive assets in 2011, in 2014, and most likely they will have no productive assets in 2015 either. This is perhaps, I'm zooming inside the productive assets now, and I'm looking at the productive assets, which is by definition what rich people in these villages have. It's the most valuable productive assets in this economy, which is land. A baseline, the ultra-poor had very limited access to land. Almost none of them owned some land, and a few of them managed to rent. Fewer than 1 in 10 of them had access to land. So the graph is going to show you what happens after 7 years. You see the control group, if they keep on the same trajectory, they're going to be flat. The treatment group skyrockets. You go from about 1 in 10 owning land to about 4 in 10 owning land. In the second part of this presentation, I want to quantify these effects because they all look good in terms of trends, right? Everything is going up at an increasing rate. That's a nice piece of news. But how big are they relative to the people who are better off in these villages? As Robin mentioned this morning, we have data not just on the ultra-poor, but on women on every social class in the village. So what I'm going to show you now is the gap between the ultra-poor and the middle classes, the baseline, and then the same gap between those two same classes, the ultra-poor and the middle classes, 7 years later. This is only in treatment villages. So the first, and it's always on the same items, which are the items that we use for the cost-benefit analysis. So the first is non-durable expenditure per capita. At baseline, the gap is 1.7, right? After 7 years, it's gone down to 1.5. So there is still a gap. Obviously, we're not saying that the program makes the ultra-poor overtake the middle classes. That wouldn't be not even sensible. But clearly, it reduces these gaps by a large extent. That's the same figure, even more stark, for durable expenditures. At baseline, there's a gap of 7. After 7 years, the gap goes down to 4. Savings. Actually, this is perhaps, in my opinion, the most powerful result of the ultra-poor program. It's true that the ultra-poor can consume more thanks to the extra income, but the stark result is that they save a lot more. And saving is important because it's what allows them to accumulate further productive assets and get out of the poverty trap. And you see that the gap in savings was enormous at baseline. The ultra-poor had no savings at all. It becomes much smaller after 7 years. Productive assets, again, an enormous gap, 30 times. The middle class had 30 times the value of productive assets than the ultra-poor. They still have more, but it's more like 12 times now. So the gap is large, but it's way smaller than it was to start with. Livestock value, the asset transferred by the program. This is obviously the starkest effect because it's the program that's transferring this asset. But also business assets value, which are not transferred by the program. These are things like rickshaws, vans, things that they can use to transport the goods to the markets. These are not transferred by the program. These are assets that the ultra-poor accumulate out of their own choice. And you see that the gap falls from 11 to 4. And finally, the biggest assets of all, land. Here, as Robin already mentioned this morning, the richest households in these communities, in these poor communities, are rich because they own land. After baseline, the gap is 35. That is, the value of land owned by the middle classes is 35 times more than the value of land owned by the ultra-poor. After 7 years, the gap has fallen to 18. Still large, obviously, there's still a lot of inequality in assets in these villages, but again, the point is that it's much smaller. And that's all I wanted to say about the trends in a 7-year time period. We've seen that perhaps those cost-benefit analyses, which we thought were a bit heroic in assuming that the benefits would be sustained, that actually turned out to be a lower bound. If we take the 7 years number seriously, the benefit side of the equation increases even more.
Give you a bit of background of where this project is coming from. So we've seen results from the evaluation of the BRAC program. It turns out, as you know as well, that the BRAC program inspired a number of replications in the number of countries. And those replications, thanks to effort by Dean Carlin of IPA, by CGAP, and by the Ford Foundation, and with a lot of support from BRAC, were actually all part of joint randomized evaluations. When I say joint, they had different research teams, so each project had slightly different groups, but the programs were really meant to implement the BRAC approach, graduation approach, in different countries after, of course, suitable adaptation to the local context. So the way this was done ensured is, first of all, the BRAC teams visited many, if not all, of the sites. Second of all, there was regular meetings convened by CGAP in various places in the world, often Paris, of everybody who was participating in this evaluation, where there were kind of exchange notes and trades, etc. So although you have different implementation of the program in the details, for example, depending on the wealth of the countries, you might have different size of the transfer, different costs, slightly different versions of how much support was provided, etc. The intent is really to keep the same philosophy and the same basic approach and adapt it to the local conditions and then evaluate it in all of those conditions. So all of these results are now out for 2 years and 3 years and were published last spring. To summarize, this is a summary, and in a sense here again the summary is going to be quite similar to what Robin discussed this morning. You get an improvement in a number of dimensions of the life of the ultra-poor across, this is the average across all of the sites. You get improvement in per capita consumption of 0.12 for the standardization, which corresponds to about 10%. In household assets index, food security, people borrow a little more, partly because they become eligible for microfinance at the end of it. They have much more savings, they spend more time working, they are in better physical health, slightly much better mental health, and they have greater political participation. This is the result for all of the sites combined. This doesn't include Bangladesh, but looks very, very similar, except Bangladesh is perhaps on the high side in terms of the effect, but the results basically replicated in all of these places. EL means end line 1, end line 2, so 3-year result, 2-year result, 3-year results. And this is the difference, each of these bars is the difference between treatment and control, so each of these bars is a treatment effect. So you can start seeing a bit of the answer to what's happening over time, which was very heartening between end line 1 and end line 2, is that there was not much of a decline in the effects between end line 1 and line 2. Based on that, after some back and forth in the refereeing process, we did the cost-benefit analysis of the program, assuming that the results largely persist. We didn't assume 100% persistent, but we assume largely persistent. We have any number of variation and that one can play with, of course, in the paper, but these numbers assume, I think, a 10% decline over a gradual decline of 10% over the initial finding and line 2 finding, and report that to the cost. And you can see that with that assumption, very similar to what Oriana just told us, the cost-benefit analysis looks good in all countries except in Honduras, where there was no consumption gain at any point. One of the places where I wanted to pay particular attention perhaps is India, not just because it's the highest number, not just because it's the one I was involved with, not just because it's West Bengal and therefore right across the border from Bangladesh, not just because it's implemented by Bandiera, which is a very, like, the daughter organization, I would say, to BRAC, but because this is where we have 7-year results that I want to show you. So, a little bit of zooming in on the Bandiera program, very similar, very, very similar to the initial graduation program by BRAC. People get a productive asset transfer. Vast majority of them got 2 cows, but there was also 4 goats or 1 cow and 2 goats, some non-farm enterprises. In more recent version of the programs, it's moved more towards non-farm enterprises, but in our sample we have a lot of cows. And they get the weekly training on topics related to the assets, broader social and health issues that we discussed earlier this morning. And then they get a stipend for the first 13 to 40 weeks, depending on the asset, and there is some required savings as part of the program. Here's the timeline we got. So in February 2007, we conducted the baseline, and then the program started. The N-line 1 was after 2 years. And line 2 after 3 years, 2 years after the program was started, and line 2 after 3 years, so 1 year after graduation. And then the control group was actually left alone. Not that Bandan stopped expanding, they expanded dramatically, but they went and expanded elsewhere. So the control group is entirely left alone in the villages until January 14, where we go and pay them a visit. Thanks to a lot of help from the Bandan staff that was still there and knew where they were. So we also have very, very little attrition in our final end lab. So what I'm going to show you now are two experimental results comparing the treatment group who received the program to the control group that didn't receive the program. They were initially, beneficiaries were randomly selected among eligible participants. The randomization was done within villages. And they are still the same. One note that is important is that not everybody who was offered the program agreed to participate due to a combination of factors. One of them is not everybody felt confident they could handle the asset correctly. And then there was also some rumors about the fact that maybe Bandan was trying to convert people. It is surprising to me that in none of the other sites you find refusals, because I think if someone would show up to my doorstep and offer me 2 goods, 2 cows, I would be somewhat suspicious of their intent. So we had some refusals. The results I'm showing you do not take into account of that. I'm comparing the entire group that I tried to reach to the entire group that we didn't try to reach. So in technical jargon, that's intention to treat estimate. That means if you wanted to know the full impact in your mind, you can scale this up by multiplying by 1.2 or 1.2. But that, of course, ensures by showing you just a pure difference between treatment and control, I'm doing a lower bound of what the effects might be. And of course, the groups are still fully random, since this is the groups I intended to treat in the first place. Okay, what do we find? So this is an overview. This is the same graph that I showed you before, but just for India, and adding a little green bar for end line 3. Each of these bars is simply the difference between treatment and control at the various end lines. So just after the program ended, 1 year later, and then at 7 years. And these results are very consistent with the result Oriana showed us, largely show not only a persistence of the program, but it seems to be that the program effect actually increased between end-line 2 and end-line 3, and between end-line 1 and end-line 2. So we see larger effect after 7 years than after 3 years. So it seems that the effect build up on each other as opposed to slowly decay. To start with, India is one of the programs that had larger effects. If you remember, a 0.12 increase in consumption in the sample as a whole it was 0.3 in West Bengal. By end line 3, 0.37. So the effect actually had increased. This is in relation to the current consumption of the control group, so this is accounting for any growth that would have happened anyway, of course. The household assets index, we start from a reasonably small effect in N 1.8 of a standardization to 0.27. The food security index continues to improve, which is something that is striking to me because I'll show you the components made of asking people how often someone has skipped a meal, and it's not that often to start with. So you wouldn't expect there's so much margin to increase the effect, but we seem to find it. The total amount borrowed, which had increased immediately after the program went back to 0. Total savings has gone up. The total time spent working is the one result where the results are a bit smaller but still quite large. The physical health and the mental health index is ones that I find particularly interesting because we had a result at end line 1. We show a lessening of the effect by end line 2, but then it's back up with a vengeance in end line 2 and 3. people might have become slightly habituated to become richer by inline 2, and so their kind of initial burst of happiness went away, but then, maybe they are substantially richer by inline 3, and so that makes one distinctly better off. I don't know whether that's the explanation, but I think it's interesting. The rest of the talk is really more of the same by distinguishing between various types of the component of each of these intakes. So you see the total consumption per capita. You see that there is a distinct improvement in the control group. So the trend is what Oriana showed. There is some trend. People are doing better, but proportionally they increase actually faster by inline by inline 3 than earlier. That's also true for food consumption per capita, and that's also true for durable good per capita, although the effects are larger there, smaller there to start with. These are the food security results that I was talking about. These are, although about 60% of people claim, in the control group, claim by inline 3 that everyone in the household gets enough food every day. Of course, this is an ultra-poor sample, so there is some vulnerability. And by inline 3 in the treatment group, it's moved up to 79%. All of the others are more restrictive, and all of them, you're getting very, very close to 100% on some of these answers. But even when you're very, very close to 100%, you still find effect in the treatment group. So that means that the one kind of residually very poor people seem to be still helped by this program. These are the results on assets. So you find an increase in assets relatively constant across end line. The productive assets is where we see a slight decline, and the household assets instead. So maybe people started to convert their cows into other things that they needed in their home. Income and revenue, the most interesting, there are two, I think, interesting facts. One is that the proportionality of the effect for the income and revenues for the livestock, which is what most people got. You would have expected it might have started to go down or something if people had sold the cow. In fact, it's exploding, maybe because the cows had started to have babies. And then the other thing that I want to notice is the non-farm income. Remember, most people get cows, so they don't directly get anything that helped them start a non-farm businesses. By inline 2, we had noted that we start to see people diversifying out of cows into other things. By inline 3, this trend is very much accentuated, where you see essentially a doubling of the non-farm business income coming from this household. So the diversification continues. So you see, it's not that you give people cows and then just take care of their cows. They do that, but at the same time, they also move into something that may be more, that may be even better suited to them. It's more of the same. You can see the physical health result playing out. Generally, people are becoming healthier. But they are becoming even healthier in the treatment group, so we have a physical health result at the end of it. The mental health result is a very interesting one. We had a leveling by inline 3, which go back up by inline 2, which go back up by inline 3, where we are, or just about half of the people in the control group have experienced something looking like depression. We have a depression index scale built there. And it's moved up to moved down to 37% in the treatment group. So that's actually a pretty significant decline. And people also self-report to be happier and less stressed out. It shows an increase in the stress index, but in all of these graphs, more is better. So a bigger bar means less stressed out. So people are less likely to be depressed, they're less stressed out, they generally self-report to be happier. And that took some time to kick off. But we now see it very clearly. One thing that would be one note of maybe warning or maybe future research would be interesting to look into is that there is substantial heterogeneity in the effect of this program by quintile. So you can look at this both ways. You can splice the sample by how poor the poor people were. They are ultra poor, but not all equally ultra poor. Or you can look at quintile, at the quantile treatment effect, and look at where the effects are they located towards the top of the distribution or towards the bottom of the distribution. And very much in terms of income and revenue, the effects are larger at all end line, and that's still true at end line 3, at the top of the distribution. So this is something that these people are not rich by any means, but it is the less poor of the ultra poor that benefit the most from the program. It is less true for consumption, where we see the effect being more distributed. And one could have been worried in the first endline that, for example, by endline 1, that the consumption effects are more similar at different quantiles. That means the ultra poor of the ultra poor actually eating the transfer away, and the effect is going to disappear for them. What is interesting is that when you look at endline 3, we still have effects at the bottom of the consumption, so that they didn't eat everything away. We still have persistence of effect at every quantile. And it's true when you divide it the other way, which is we also have persistence of effect when you look at the people who are the poorest to start with, also have effect that persist over time. So how exactly this squares up, I don't fully know, but this is important to notice. There is, although everybody benefits, there is still heterogeneity in how much. Two important conclusions from this finding. First of all, the Buard findings are replicated in most of 6 other sites. As Abhijit pointed out earlier, the lowest effect are the richest countries. The long-run results for India and Bangladesh are even more striking. The effect do not go down. Instead, most of them seem to get even larger. And some of the effect that had gone down a little bit by endline 2 have gone back up again. For example, mental health. It seems to be that there is something like a poverty trap in which these people were, and that got unlocked, at least for some of them. I don't have the full story for you, or rather I have any number of full stories, and I'm sure you have any number of others. Mental health could be one of them, or more traditional explanations in terms of startup for a business, ability to take on willingness to take on more risky projects because I just you receive a gift, so you don't need to reimburse it. I don't know. This is, I think, very much the next step. What we need to be thinking about today, in the near future, is understanding the mechanism of what makes this happen, and I think correlatedly, what do we do for the poorest of the ultra poor, which still have the lowest effect in this group. I think understanding why and how people benefited in this very durable way will help us understand what do we do for the people who are still left behind. Thank you very much.
The really striking finding, I think, is that after 7 years, not only are people in Bangladesh and West Bengal not slipping back into very, very deep poverty, but particularly climbing further out of it. To signal a little bit of a turn in this conference, I think we now need to start thinking about sort of so what. So we know that ultra-poor programs can work in lots of different countries. We know that at least in a couple of places they can work over the long term. But the truth is that NGOs and governments do things all the time that they don't know work. They also do things, I'm afraid, which they know perfectly well do not work. They're not cost effective. They don't meet the objectives that are set up for them. They're a waste of money. This is true in the developing world. It's true in the West. For example, in the UK, we do things like bid for the Olympic Games and build offshore wind turbines. So there's a large gap, unfortunately, between things that are shown to be effective and things that actually happen. So we need to start thinking about these things. So I'll introduce the 3 people on this panel, just very quickly. Kate Mckee is a senior advisor at the consultative group to assist the poor. Imran Matin is the international program director at Save the Children, but formerly head of research at Buard. And Chantal Buard is the head of digital at Amplifier strategies. Amplifier is kind of a bridge between donors and programs, social programs, but aims to sort of sharpen both. And I want to ask a general question to these 3 people. If they could first please explain how their work relates to ultra-poor programs. And then also answer the following question, which is, do we now know enough? And, can we now say, okay, fine, let's start sending donor money to these sorts of programs, let's scale them up. Do we need to know more before we do so? What sort of things should we be looking for as we do scale them up?
On the first, in terms of how does the work that I sort of currently do and my organization currently does, how it relates, I mean, I think it would be fair to say that the biggest brunt of extreme poverty in many ways is borne by children and women of the household. Women and children are the biggest brunt bearers of extreme poverty. From that point of view, for Save the Children, child poverty is a fundamental part of our work, fundamental area in which we work, so it's sort of extremely connected. So from that, at a very high level, there's a clear alignment, and we do a lot of work primarily through cash transfer programs. So Save the Children globally is a leading organization in terms of all types of cash transfer program around the world. So I think the cash transfer program is the one big vehicle through which we work. However, I think the biggest challenge is that, and this is something I will come to later. I think it's great to see all this evidence, and I think we have a lot of great evidence, great body of evidence, and I think very powerful ones, and one that we can show is long lasting. But from a global point of view, this is still a proof of concept. Given the global problem of extreme poverty, this is still proof of concept. We've just basically the body of evidence which says that what we have right now is something that works, is effective. What we now need to do is the next two steps, which is from effective to something that's efficient, and then take to scale. And from effective to efficient is actually the hardest journey, because moving from something that's effective to something that's efficient requires us to really ask the hard question. And what Ujit was basically talking about, what are the core elements here that actually matter, which actually drive, which is the critical impact pathway here. And I think unless we can really do that, we cannot scale, because a lot of the scaling will not happen through great organizations like BRAC and London. It's going to happen with multifarious organizations which are not have similar level of capability. It will happen through government infrastructure. So I think it's really important that whilst we are excited about these results, we should be humble that this is basically the beginning of the journey. We've just proven effective. We now need to really challenge ourselves on efficiency, and then to really think about scale. And I think that's the sort of biggest challenge. I'll stop here.
As Joel mentioned, I work for Amplifier Strategies, and we're based in San Francisco, and we work with visionary investors and leaders to actually build and scale mission-driven programs. And so how we entered into graduation is 2 years ago. We were looking for the best poverty program out there for one of our clients. And it was a moment in time where BRAC had an amazing track record, and also the CGAP for pilots were just coming out very successful. However, it was clear that there remained a need for infrastructure and actually to address the operational realities of actually scaling this graduation. So we said another way is, how do we create the pathways for a graduation program to exist globally? And so we actually created a reinforcing strategy, like 3 strategies. One of them was to create global advocacy to actually share this program with governments and implementing partners and MFIs. The second one was creating cutting-edge technology tools and trainings that would actually accelerate the implementation and achieve quality outcomes at scale. And the third one was to actually invest in a network of partners where we can actually help them expand to other countries. And so we created an initiative called Uplift, and it's a collaborative initiative between donors and cross-sector partners to actually accelerate the global adoption of graduation. So I personally work on the second part of the strategy, which is the technology part. This technology is actually to find out what parameters are working. We're doing a pilot with BRAC, but the goal is to have a technology that can work with any governments, any organizations, any MFI who actually are implementing graduation. And find out what are the parameters that are actually working, not working, what can we actually learn from it over time.
Thank you very much.
I'm quite influenced by what I've been hearing the last 2 days, largely from government implementers. And so I have, I think, 4 points I want to make briefly in this first. So CGAP, as has been mentioned a few times, CGAP teamed with the Ford Foundation, inspired by the BRAC targeting the ultra-poor program, to support the replication. And as Esther was explaining, these were of quite consistently applied models, largely implemented by NGOs. And we're a financial inclusion knowledge hub. So this was sort of an odd thing for us to do, but it came out of our history in microfinance and our respect for the question that BRAC was asking of why aren't very poor people being served by microfinance, and what model would work. And that seemed to us a really important question to pursue. Let me make 4 quick points on the question of, so what? Do we know enough? So we have, over the last 6 months or so, been polling governments that are getting into this area. They have concluded we know enough. We have found, we've documented 32, and we know there's at least another 18 government initiatives to scale up graduation, to adapt and scale up graduation. So the impact evidence, and I know this can be nerve-wracking for the researchers, but it started trickling out a few years ago, well, long before the actual published results in the referee journal. And governments were interested, and it resonated in different ways with what they were trying to accomplish. I think it's really important to say that the social protection community, the movement worldwide, had become cognizant of the limitations of a safety net and protection strategy. And we're really trying to move towards productive inclusion, productive safety nets. It's called different things in different places, but the CCT programs in Latin America were wanting to go beyond CCTs. Africa was committing to creating a safety net, but doing it in a way that also supported people over the longer term. So governments have started to focus on this, and their question is how to do it, not whether. They're focused on the trade-offs. It is the social protection agencies negotiating with the ministries of finance over how much money to spend per household, as opposed to how many households you can serve, and what are the long-term benefits versus the short-term benefits. And that's really the kind of argument that's going on. As Imran pointed out, it's about the efficiencies. So we see strong trends towards cash transfer of the asset, towards digitization of the consumption payments, electronic delivery onto cards and into accounts and so on, towards what one might call a sort of communitarized delivery of the coaching, the livelihoods support, trying to find lower cost ways to do that. So big focus on efficiency. And I think the knowledge agenda that will come out of this is what's the performance, what is the minimum package, which I guess is something that came up this morning, and the performance, the relative contribution of the different components. Very importantly, extreme poor people are not an undifferentiated mass. So I think the findings about that show the relative effects for the very poor of the very poor as opposed to the not quite so poor are really important, and we need to probe on segmentation, because this will help figure out where to target the resources as well. And maybe the whole package isn't needed by everybody, and that would be a way to save money rather than saying, let's just do cash transfers. And finally then, I think there are going to be maybe 3 models, archetypes that settle down in these government initiatives. And at that point, we need to get the next round of impact research underway.
Yes. Thank you very much. My first question is to Oriana. I just wonder if you could talk a little bit more about the labour market effects of the targeting the ultra-poor program that you studied. So I'm interested in what happened to the going rate for domestic service and for agricultural labour when women started to pull back a bit from those activities. And did the return to livestock rearing fall simply because there were more cows around?
Yeah, thank you. This is a very interesting question. So to answer the question, I have to tell you first how the labour markets looked at baseline. Very shortly, there's only 3 jobs that these women in these communities can choose from, and these 3 jobs are casual labour in agriculture, casual labour as maid, and livestock rearing. It's not imposed from us, from our survey, but we measure all sorts of occupations, and these are the only 3 that account for most of the hours. And there is a very stark correlation between the job choice and poverty. Namely, it's only the ultra poor who do casual labor. The effect of the program, by giving them a cow, makes them shift from casual labor to livestock rearing. They don't completely abandon these occupations. They still engage, especially in agriculture, in casual labor in agriculture, but their labor supply in these occupations dropped dramatically. Now, given that they were the only ones or the main ones offering this labor in the communities, the labor supply at the community level shifts backward. And as you know from Econ 101, if the labor supply shifts backward, the wage goes up. And indeed, that's what we observe in the data. The wage paid for maid services and for agricultural laborers go up, not just for the ultra poor, but for everybody else in the sample who's engaged in this type of labor. Now, you can imagine a counteracting effect on the livestock side, because as they do fewer hours in wage labor, they do more in livestock rearing. But compared to the total stock of cows in those communities, the cows transferred by BRAC account for less than 5%, because the richer women in those communities have a lot of cows. They don't just have 1 or 2 like the ultra poor get from BRAC. So what we call the general equilibrium effect, that is the effect of giving cows to the ultra poor on the price of milk and eggs in case of chicken, and also the value of cows themselves, is negligible. So there is a positive externality, a positive impact on the wages for those engaged in maid services and agricultural labor, but there is no negative impact on the livestock markets.
Interesting. Thank you very much. And Imran, from your perspective, having worked for BRAC and also for Save the Children, so BRAC is a very, very unusual organisation. It can take a very long-term view. It has quite stable funding, and it can it has a research arm. It's capable of facilitating long-term randomized controlled trials, and that makes it very unusual. Could you speak to sort of what the learning process is among sort of international NGOs?
I think what is really unique about BRAC is its ability to take a long-term view and its courage to crawl the design space. I think it is an amazing organization that just knows how to crawl the design space constantly and constantly, do microsurgeries on a particular design to make it more and more fit to the reality and make it more impactful. I think that is actually the most unique muscle that BRAC basically has. And in some ways, I think I'll be a bit controversial here. I think the whole evaluative approach that was taken in the ultra poor program, especially through our city, in some ways, I think created a bit of a trade-off and tension in terms of pursuing a more of a crawling design space approach and a more RCT-oriented approach. And I think there have been missed opportunities there, due to which I think under natural circumstances, BRAC would have been far more crawling over the design space than it actually did in this particular program. If you look at some of the other programs that BRAC does, start off from the 70s, Mushtaka is here, on the early 80s on this oral rehydration therapy extension program. That was, it was basically a constant action research program where there was a constant crawling of the design space and constantly trying to find out, more optimal models. Now, so I think they can be at the margin trade-off between rigor and crawling of design space that we really need to do. And I think we need to be mindful about this tension. I'm not saying that, we sort of take off that, and we should be very mindful in terms of how we balance these two domains, because I think we need both. And especially if we're going to challenge ourselves to design programs for the poorest and for the most marginalized, the left behind, the SDG, zero targets and all that, it's going to be even more important that on the one hand we have got rigor, on the other hand we basically enable organizations to be able to crawl the design space. And I think we just need to find how we create more, a greater balance between that. And I think that's where the also very relevant to this whole enablement is the donor funding architecture. I think still the donor, funding instruments are increasingly veering towards, a more of a compliance-driven, just sort of design deliver type of an approach, and does not take the crawling of design space. I know that Alex is sort of coming later to talk about Global Innovation Fund. That's I think a breath of fresh air in terms of how more experimental and crawling the design space approach can be enabled. But I think that is really fundamental. So international NGOs generally are not very good in crawling the design space. They're very, very donor driven. And they're very project driven. They do not use a lot of their unrestricted money in the most strategic way to build on from a small pilot and then layer on more restricted money. These are all things that international NGOs do struggle with, and including the organization that I'm working with. It's a challenge we're aware of, and we really want to challenge ourselves on that. But I think donors have a big role to play here, enabling that to happen.
Yes, thank you very much.
I'm actually part of the design team that's really looking at the next flagship extreme poverty program in Bangladesh. So on the European Commission. What's coming out there, we've looked at the BRAC model, but there are also other models operating inside Bangladesh, and we've also looked at different push-pull models coming out of Horn of Africa. And what I'm trying to do, and what I'm interested in, it's a common theme through all the different presentations is sustainability. So my mission is for an extreme poverty program to make that sustainable in the face of a range of geopolitical, economic, and natural hazard shocks, and the changes driving those, which are geopolitical, demographics, everything like this over the next 10 years. The thing that's coming out already from what we're seeing is that our notion of what sort of graduation means, of what sustainability means, about what works and what doesn't work, is sort of going a little bit beyond the sort of asset-driven thresholds of what graduation means. And the key thing that we're finding is that the parameters that work or what don't work and what's sustainable now, these may not be the same parameters in 5 or 10 years' time because things are changing all the time. The goalposts are moving, shocks are changing, and changes are driving the way why people in poverty is working. So I guess my question that I'm coming to, and it comes down to cost benefit and measuring all this sort of businesses. For me, the ultimate sustainability test of an extreme poverty reduction program, it has to be stress and shock testing. So I'm very interested, firstly, to see if any studies have looked at performance around big shocks, because that gives you a real notion of whether you have a sustainable exit out of poverty or not. And with change, Bangladesh, they have a range of different changes online. Climate change is just one, but also geopolitical changes. The second question is the how. The implications of overcreating a resilience approach, which basically gives more people choices to manage shocks and stresses to both protect and sustain those gains, implies an adaptive management of the programming. That means there's feedback loops throughout the programming, there's crisis modifiers if a shock happens and development funding can be used. So I don't think really the pennies drop with people who are not only looking at extreme poverty, but then looking to protect and sustain those gains, which have a lot to do with cost benefit. There implies an adaptive management about how those programs are run, how they're funded, and the flexibility associated. So 2 questions. Has anyone done any type of shock or stress modelling in terms of impacts of these programs? And secondly, is anyone looking at any sort of adaptive management styles of these types of extreme poverty programs?
Thank you. That's a good question. Let's just take one more. That's a rather broad question. So just one more, please.
Matthew Green, Slaves and Desert. Kate, I was very interested in what you were saying about the level of government interest. Could you just repeat the number of governments? I couldn't quite catch it. My question is, are these governments thinking about implementing the whole model for a sort of single agency, or are they thinking more in terms of looking at current government provision, maybe coming from different ministries, and seeing how they cohere to basically provide the model, maybe spotting gaps and filling them? because I've heard the latter from government officials from Brazil and Indonesia, actually. I think it was at a CGAP Ford Foundation meeting in Paris last year, so which is very interesting and sort of potentially very practical. But which way are governments going?
Thank you very much, Adi, for those questions. So the two questions are then, one is about how governments are actually implementing these programs, and the other is a question really about how ultra-poor programs can be made sustainable in a fundamentally unstable, changeable world.
So there, we identified 32 governments that provided information to us on their graduation adaptations and scale-ups, or some are in advanced planning stages. And we know there are another 15 that EFAD is working with, but we don't have information on that yet. And then we had another 4 that came forward in the Global Learning event, and so we're going to be following up on those. And these are both at a federal and in some cases at a state level. So for example, we have Jaya from Trickle Up here in the room, and they're working in a really interesting model with 2 Indian states, each of which is larger than probably the ambit of most social protection agencies in most countries. So it's a distinct trend. So far, I think we see 2 different models, and you described one of them very well, where Indonesia, Brazil has, Mexico, even Paraguay has an existing program, and it puts someone in charge of knitting that all together. So finding the households so they're not getting this one year and that another year and that another year, and trying to actually make it more sequenced and fill in the gaps. And often the livelihoods part of it, the easy part is the safety net, and the hard part is organizing the livelihoods in some kind of viable way. And the coaching is very challenging, and it's an expensive element. And I think you were debating that as I arrived midday today. The other model we see is de novo. So Mozambique, Tanzania, Ghana did this with their LEAP program, where it is a little bit more a design from scratch graduation package. One of the things we expected to see when we did this survey was a substantial streamlining of the model away from the essential components that were defined by BRAC, and we do not see that yet. So most of both the knitting together and the de novos are still trying to implement the whole package with the kind of efficiencies that we've that have come up in the panel so far, and probably this morning as well.
Thank you. Who would like to have a go at Andrew's question? It's a very good question.
Of course, we can't tell you what would happen in 20 years, or if there was a war between India and Pakistan, because fortunately it has not happened in the space that we are following them. But in both places, in India and Bangladesh, quite a number of things happen over 7 years. So what you can say is that whatever gains have been, at least for enough people, have been persistent enough and increased enough so that the effects are actually larger when you get them 7 years later than when they were after 3 years. So that's sort of, in a sense, I don't know what else to say except that we can, continue following them. But eventually, at some point, you make a decision that it does not collapse. Now, one thing that we should do, and Abhijit showed a little bit of that this morning, and we haven't done systematically, but both of us can do that, is look at what the closest we can get with the data we have is look at how people react to individual shocks. So when people in the either treatment or control groups keep being hit by something or the other, both places are plenty of weather-related shocks and floods and stuff like that, and one could look at the impact of those shocks on beneficiaries and non-beneficiaries. So see, for example, whether some of the gains are wiped out when something like that happens, or on the contrary, whether the asset base that you have built helps you catch up with it. And Abhijit showed a little bit of that about Ghana earlier today, saying that both the both the build-up of both helping people to save and the full program involving the saving seem to help building that resilience. But one can certainly do more of that, and then you would get a little bit of an ability to sort of simulate or guess what would happen with larger shock, for example, climate-related shocks, which would definitely hit some of these people in Bangladesh.
Yeah, I think one aspect of this program, which I haven't sort of noticed in the evaluation question, is there is a very strong inclusion aspect to this program. As a matter of fact, this was one of the first programs where I think we really took the idea of how do we include the ultra poor into the social milieu much more strongly. And there was, I'm sorry, I keep on saying we for brag, because once brag, always brag. We came up with something called a Village Poverty Alleviation Committee. This was basically a committee of good social elites in the community, through which we wanted to start changing the norms around how extreme poor are supported or looked or perceived by the community. And I think there was also a very strong attempt to include the ultra poor in different social fora, social committees as well. Now I think that whole inclusion aspect is very important. If we're going to talk about resilience, I think a lot of the resilience is also, how do we get community, how do we ensure that there is no crowding out of the community support that usually basically happens, because of the sort of additional sort of intervention. And what, from a general equilibrium point of view, what is the social general equilibrium here in terms of the sort of impact on the broader ultra poor community in a particular village? And I think that aspect would be a very interesting line of inquiry to sort of look at, and the intervention is there.
Oriana wants to.
Sorry, just a very quick point.
Yeah.
One important difference between the ultra poor program and a lot of social protection programs is that this is a one-shot program. Okay, it's a massive transfer, but it's all done within a year. Also, the intensive support is all done within a year. So that makes it a lot more resilient to changes in the environment, because you don't have to be there on the field year after year after year. You just go, you make this intervention. It's the classical thing, you're teaching people how to fish. In this case, you're teaching people how to tend the cow. But once you teach them, they're independent. So some sustainability is inbuilt in the program. So all the risks and all the shocks that you can have to program implementation are not relevant here, because once the program is implemented, the implementers leaves.
That's the problem with graduation.
Well, it would be if there was no long-term effect, but there is.
That's the problem. Yeah. This is something that came out of Bangladesh. Is a critical thing in terms of sustainability for us are those people that graduate, do they then participate? Do they have a new participation in different networks?
Yeah, but indeed they do.
But they do.
Indeed.
In fact,
you do one new thing and then you're gone, and then what happens?
No.
But they do.
The changes sustain.
The result, they do. 7 years later, you go back, and I think Imran is perfectly right to point out that it was there in the result, but I didn't insist on it. You do find improvement in political participation, in social participation, in inclusion in various groups. So all of that, is inbuilt in the program, and you have effect of that. So it makes no sense to say sustainability on the program doesn't mean sustainability of people whose salary is paid by the program. Exactly. It means sustainability of the effect, which could come in some circumstances depending on the program by having people permanently. I am totally in favor of deworming year after year after year, or continue having teachers year after year after year, because if you remove the teacher, there is not going to be educated kids anymore. But it doesn't have to be. So it turns out in this case that it's a one-shot, very large program once. The program could have gone away, that didn't. So you cannot say, well, the problem is they go away. Well, it would have been a problem if you had no persistence in the effect. But once you do, you have to take that into account in your view of the world. You have to take in the evidence and say, what did I learn? We learned something that a one-shot, expensive, complicated way to do things has effects that look permanent, I don't know, because it's 7 years, but that look reasonably long-term. there are any number of questions that remain, but you can't just say, well, no, it's not a resilient program because they go away. That doesn't make sense.
Yeah. Can I ask Chantal to speak just very, very quickly, and then I want to ask Esther to respond to something else that was said, please.
It was just to answer your second question, why we're building a technology tool that actually to help organizations be responsive and create feedback. It's very short. It's about the set of intervention, different contexts, the timing of the intervention, the frequency of the intervention, so all of that to get that feedback we can actually be able to respond and adapt.
Yes, thank you very much. Esther, I just wanted to ask you to respond quickly to something that Imran said earlier. He implied, I think, that there's quite a painful trade-off between learning and assessment.
I didn't say painful.
No. I didn't.
Simplify that, exaggerate.
No, I didn't want to respond to that. I entirely agree with that. In fact, there are various places where, I love to intervene very early in program because I like the design aspect of it, but credibly to do. But if I'm going to do that, I know that the first few years is going to be keeping iterating, and the real RCT comes once things have stabilized to something that everybody agrees is sort of the best shot we have at the moment. So I totally agree, and even within that, there is permanent tinkering at the margin, which is usually made possible because by that time you have established a lot of trust and confidence between research teams and the partners, and those don't necessarily go in with RCT in the first place. You keep inventing and reinventing. So I have no response to that except that I agree 100%. What I would like to go back on is some of the things you said very early on, which I agree with, but I think the 7-country evaluation tells us a little bit something about. So one is on the efficiency. I don't know what, I think you meant, is it the most efficient way to do it? So I don't exactly know how we talk about effectiveness or efficiency in this case. I think it means, if it means cost effectiveness, then this is cost effective, however complicated it is. It might not be the best way to do it, but it is a way to do it that pays for itself largely. So in that sense, it might not be the best way to do it, but it is a way to do it that works just fine and pays for itself. There might be some pieces of it that are not needed, and I completely agree. And this was this is an agenda that has started, and we saw some of it today with Abhijit's presentation and with the Pakistan work as well, of trying to find out, if I pare it down, will it still work? So far, not very encouraging. That in fact, it does matter to have all of these things in place. So perhaps some sweet post was achieved. But so it's not necessarily the best footwear, and we still need a lot of operational research to see, and a lot of RCT in my view, to see what do we need like at the core of it. But it is something that we could take and scale up the way it is. That we have better evidence for it than for pretty much anything else at the moment. The second of it, which is the will it work with less good organizations? We have an answer to that because, with all due respect to everybody who participated in the large replications, there was a lot of variation in the quality of the implementation. From Bandiera, which is a superb organization, to Pakistan, where it was run by many micro NGOs with I'm sure absolutely formidable energy and goodwill, but certainly not the human capital you find in BRAC, and then really anything in between. So the nice thing you have from the evolution, it's only 7 countries, and maybe you go down the scale and it would have been different, but we do learn something about the questions that Chantal was pointing, which is how do we is it possible to take a model for something that's not trivial because it has all these components and moving parts, and convey it to partners that vary widely in terms of their quality and where they come from. And there was even some governments involved in the scale-up of this organization. The biggest effect of all the countries we found in Ethiopia, which is government-run. So as a one data point, that's not enough and we need more. But there is some element that suggests the difference in the results that we find from country to country. One thing it's not driven by is by the quality of the organization. So I think it has something to do with the convening effort, etc., the meetings and the like. But it means it's possible. So I think that was the thing that I kind of wanted to say. We've learned, I'm not saying we couldn't learn more, we can learn more, but I think that processing teaches us something about it's not just track. I think it's very important to have that.
Thank you very much. I'm afraid Katie is going slightly crazy at the back there. We're going to have to continue this over tea and coffee. I'd like to thank the two presenters and everybody on the panel. Nobody likes journalists, but we hit deadlines. Or at least close. Thank you very much.